Hi everyone, my name is Stacey Pope. I'm based at Durham University in the UK, and my presentation today is looking at global women's football fandom. I'm obviously gutted not to be able to join you in person, but I do hope that everyone is having a fantastic conference and hopefully our paths will cross in future. So to give an overview of some of the areas I'll be talking about today, I'm using this opportunity really to discuss some of the research topics that I've covered in my work on fans of women's football. And I'm focusing in on two main areas: fans of England and US national teams, and also research around English media coverage of the Women's World Cup. Obviously, this plays an essential role in growing the fan base of women's football. So I'll start by introducing some of the research on fans of England and the US national teams. And this programme of work has been undertaken in collaboration with Dr. Rachel Allison at Mississippi State University. The rationale for our focus on global women's football fandom was the lack of research on this topic. So while a growing body of literature has recognised that women comprise a large proportion of sports fans and has critically examined gender relations and fandom, studies of women's fandom most commonly address men's sport contexts. And we argue that the lack of attention to fandom in women's football is a major omission, given that interest has grown so rapidly, as evidenced by large in-person and television audiences and high online and social media engagement, especially for World Cup tournaments, but also for other matches taking place and also in domestic leagues, for example. The growing professionalisation, commercialisation and mediatisation of women's football have opened new opportunities to follow and watch the game. And the Women's World Cup represents perhaps the pinnacle of recent transformations, with tournaments characterised by record-setting crowds, television audiences and mediatisation. So to say something briefly about the methods, for our data collection, we used in-depth interviews with 102 England and US fans who attended one or more games of the 2019 Women's World Cup. And you can see some demographic data for our participants there on the slide. Many of the fans in our sample were also fans of domestic league football. And we used an interview guide that includes a whole range of questions about participants' lifetime experiences playing and or watching sport, their pathways into and their motivations for fandom, as well as collecting data around their experiences of attending or watching women's football matches. And we'll also be following this up with further longitudinal work focused on the 2023 FIFA Women's World Cup. For this presentation then, I'll offer a brief introduction to one of the areas of this programme of work, the pathways into and motivations for fandom. And you can see details of publications connected to this up on the slide there, if this is an area of interest that you'd like to follow up. So I'll give some examples from our data set to show how women's football fandom develops. For our interviewees, the most frequently discussed precipitator of fandom was exposure to women's football mega events, especially Olympic tournaments and Women's World Cups. Events like these were discussed by 91% of US fans and 69% of England fans. In most cases, they encountered these events on television, although some fans had attended live matches. For example, when asked about how she first became a fan of women's football, 21-year-old England fan Chrissy said, "By watching it in the Olympics 2012, because I didn't really hear of it before then. It wasn't televised that I can remember." And she recalls being intrigued by this tournament and then sought out opportunities to watch women's football after this took place. For 42% of US fans and 16% of England fans, becoming a fan of women's football was linked to playing football themselves. For example, Abigail, who was aged 24 and from our US fan data set, spoke about how she remembered just growing up as a girl playing soccer. I don't remember learning about that team at the 1999 World Cup, but it was just part of the DNA of being a female soccer player at that time. A total of 26% of US fans and 18% of England fans were recruited into women's football fandom by others, typically girls or women with a strong interest in women's football. Notably, this included just under half of the men in the total sample. Some fans, like 46-year-old England fan Keith, described reverse socialisation from daughters who played football. On his women's football fandom, Keith described how it's partly to do with the fact that it's a bonding thing with my daughter. We've got something because I don't live with her. So it's like we've got something to talk about always. And, it's our thing. But I do actually like it anyway. So, yeah, I think it's pretty important. And just under a quarter of fans reported that their fandom developed through online spaces, including websites, streaming services, and through social media. For some of the youngest fans, their interest began with social media sites or applications such as Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. For example, England fan Felicity had been aware of the existence of the England women's national team, but only became a fan of this team and the domestic Super League once she stumbled across a digital platform called This Fangirl. And it was this that allowed her to make, in her words, really good friendships, which then led to her going to matches with some of these new acquaintances. Finally, amongst the England fans alone, fandom of a professional men's club extended to their women's side when their women's club was added. So that was the case for 27% of the England fans. So the men's club set up or extended the club to have a women's side, a women's team, and then that extended their fandom, so they followed both. Also, 10% of the England fans also reported their fandom began when they attended matches of a local women's team out of attachment to the place that they lived. So this study showed that media coverage of women's events was the single greatest precipitator of fandom. Therefore, opportunities exist during events like World Cup tournaments to provide information about domestic women's leagues and teams to further grow the fan base. So this brings me to the second part of the presentation, where I want to introduce you to my research on English media coverage of the FIFA Women's World Cup. And this programme of work offers the first longitudinal analysis of media coverage of women's football in the United Kingdom through a comparison of media coverage of the 2019 and 2015 FIFA Women's World Cup tournaments. For this research, we adopted a multi-method study design. Existing work has typically addressed media content or its reception, but rarely both. So in our latest article, we examine the quantity and quality of English print media coverage of the 2019 Women's World Cup in comparison to the 2015 tournament. In addition, this study also includes an examination of England fan perspectives on the media coverage of the women's national team to consider how fans perceive and respond to media coverage of women's football in their everyday lives. Now, this research is obviously building upon and extending existing feminist media studies of sport. And we develop new theoretical insights through our lens of the next stage of the new age of media coverage of women's football. So we've defined the new age as the positive shift in media representation of women's sport that was first identified in coverage of the 2015 FIFA Women's World Cup. And we refer to this shift in media representation, the shift towards greater equality, as a new age. Now, the next stage refers to our analysis of the 2019 tournament by allowing us to consider the extent to which the new age of greater gender equality that was first identified in 2015 has been sustained. This framework enables us to examine, through longitudinal work, whether the UK media coverage of the 2015 tournament was simply a one-off occurrence or whether this momentum has been sustained. And our methods for this research involved content analysis of newspaper articles and alongside 49 semi-structured interviews with fans of women's football. We analysed 5 British or English newspapers and then the interviews were with fans of the England women's team. The interview guide included questions about perceptions of the quantity and quality of media coverage of women's football. Now, we know that readership of print newspapers has been in decline, but still a quarter of UK adults consume print news daily. And so an analysis of newspaper coverage is therefore vital to consider if women's sport is becoming more visible. We argue that visibility, especially through respectful media coverage, is one contribution toward greater gender equality. Now, our quantitative analysis showed a large increase in the amount of coverage of women's football during the 2019 FIFA Women's World Cup. There was a 6-fold increase in the number of articles from 124 in 2015 to 642 in 2019. And this huge increase is evidence that coverage of women's football for the Women's World Cup has continued on a positive upwards trajectory and that we have arguably entered the next stage of the new age, with the momentum first identified for the 2015 tournament being sustained and surpassed. There was a 3-fold increase in the numbers of articles that appeared on the front pages of newspapers and a 4-fold increase in the number of photos examined in comparison to 2015. Further evidence of the increased coverage was also highlighted through a new finding in our 2019 study, women's football pullouts. Every newspaper included at least one pullout, which was a short magazine-style booklet including information solely on the Women's World Cup. This has been a key feature for men's World Cups for decades, but it's the first time that we've seen this in women's football, showing the extent to which media reporting on this mega event permeated into wider society. And we add a new dimension to the field of gender, media and sport through an analysis of fan perceptions and interpretations of media coverage. Interview participants noted that the 2019 tournament received substantial mainstream media coverage, with over 3/4 of respondents observing an increase in media coverage in recent years, especially during major tournaments. Building on a strong foundation from the 2015 World Cup, the 2019 tournament propelled women's football into mainstream news and on a scale that had not been witnessed before. So you can see an illustration of that from the data set. This respondent talks about it felt so much bigger with the focus of our summer. You're looking at the national newspapers. They were sending out some of their biggest journalists to the World Cup who weren't part of that natural group. I don't remember that happening before. All of a sudden, all these papers were women's football, women's football, women's football. Beyond the quantity of media coverage, its type or quality was also assessed. And we found that respectful coverage was sustained and to some extent improved for 2019. Some key highlights here were that the primary focus of most articles was the athletic excellence of a player or team. As in 2015, there was a continued departure from the earlier trend of sexual objectification when reporting on women's sport. So not a single article referred to a player's heterosexual appeal. Coverage was task relevant, providing information on individual or group competencies, and much of this coverage praised individual women's skills, most often the English national team. In addition, previous research suggests that women's athleticism is undermined by infantilizing terms like girls and ladies. Our findings showed that there was a reduction in the use of infantilizing language in 2019 in comparison to 2015. There was minimal appearance of the terms girls and ladies, and in contrast, there was more usage of the word lionesses. Although this term is gender marked, it also represents England women symbolically as the embodiments of strength, aggression and bravery, helping to construct a sense of national pride and identity. A new theme that was completely absent in the 2015 study was gender inequality. So in the next stage of the new age, media coverage of women's football brings issues of gender inequality to the fore and in doing so directly advocates for change. The 2019 Women's World Cup was viewed as a turning point in the newspaper reports here, It was described as a tipping point for women's football that could instigate an overdue revolution. Media coverage made visible several types or forms of inequality in women's football. One sub-theme focused upon the general treatment of women's football, and this included discussions around trialling rule changes at FIFA Women's World Cup tournaments, for instance. A second sub-theme was focused on increasing opportunities to play football, with some stories including details, for instance, on how many of the England players could not play football until their teens due to lack of access for girls and poor infrastructure. A further sub-theme focused upon the history of women's football, including the 1921 Football Association ban, and pay inequality was the final sub-theme, making direct comparisons between men's and women's football. Now, these findings are encouraging in that they're putting public pressure on organisations such as FIFA, the Football Association and US Soccer to advance gender equality through this kind of media reporting. However, locating the problem of gender inequality with sports organisations neglects the role of the media industry in reinforcing gender inequalities. And many of the interviewees in our study were critical of the time-limited revolution. They expressed frustration at this temporary and short-lived media exposure, which basically disappeared once the England national team was defeated. As this interviewee, you can see on the slide, explained, she says, suddenly we've got this England team, regardless it's women, England team in a semi-final, now everyone needs to care. Got the radio on, they keep talking about it, semi-final, 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 then you know what happens. This was when England were defeated in the semi-final last time round, and she says, boom, it wasn't something that they are still talking about. So we argue that media coverage should continue to tackle the thorny issues around gender inequality, as this does help to lobby for change amongst organisations with potential to improve conditions for women in sport. But clearly the media industry itself has the power to create real change through more coverage of women's sport. At present, media reporting that the World Cup could initiate a revolution for women's football has very clear boundaries. Okay, so just to briefly sum up then, I began obviously with an introduction to our interview-based study on England and US national team fans of women's football. And for this presentation, I focused on one strand of that work. That was the study looking at pathways into fandom. I also introduced a longitudinal analysis of media coverage of women's football in the UK. Results showed UK media coverage has seen a substantial increase in coverage of women's football over time. However, ongoing inequalities were demonstrated through the time-limited revolution, as in this was limited to the World Cup period. And interviewees expressed frustration at how coverage was temporary and short-lived, essentially dropping off a cliff edge after the tournament or once the national team was defeated. Now, clearly there's a need to undertake further research in this area. I'm aware a limitation here is that the findings I've been presenting have been limited to England and the US, and as the professionalisation, commercialisation and mediatisation continues apace in women's football across the world, future research projects will be essential to examine similarities and differences in other cultural contexts. So just to say finally, many thanks again for the opportunity to speak here today, and thank you to Professor John Norright and the organising committee for all their efforts and hard work with pulling together this event. My contact details are on the slide if you do have any follow-up questions for me individually, but thank you very much for listening. Thank you.